I owe to my dad, because my dad was a trombone player. He played in the Salvation Army band, a trad jazz, so sort of New Orleans style jazz. And he so he was at home. He's working as a teacher by then, and he still played the trombone. And he wanted someone to accompany him, basically. So from the moment I could sit, I was at the piano, learning how to play a 12-bar blues.
Wow. And from there, like, what type of artists did you start listening to when you started kind of getting into it more, like on your own?
Well, actually, the first record that I bought was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. It wasn't new out. I'm not quite that old. It was in a second-hand one, but I just like the sleeve. It's a great little. It's a brilliant sleeve, the 7-inch. But I had a really big Status Quo phase, which is funny because in the end, our tour manager of the last 20 years is the son of Young, as in Rossi Young, which is he was kind of like the fifth member. He played the harmonica, was tour manager, and wrote a lot of the big tunes. So we've ended up going full circle on Status Quo. But they released a live album called Live at the NEC, and it starts with this kind of low synth drone and a sort of bubbling crowd noise, and then you hear a little click as he plugs his guitar in. And then the Caroline chords come in, and there's this spine-tingling roar, and I listened to that moment in my bedroom again and again and again, just thinking I quite fancy that.
Yeah, so I mean, this type of music is, quite different to what you ended up doing, but equally iconic, and. How did you get from that stage of listening to rock and roll to forming Groove Armada? It must have been quite a interesting journey.
It was. Well, I mean, I lived near Leeds. I was actually, Wakefield was the smallest town, was the actual town. Leeds was the bigger town, and so in, I guess, 88, something like that, as the rave party, warehouse party thing started, and I was aware of that because my cousin had set up a free party collective called DIY in Nottingham, and they were the ones that were eventually behind or part of the Castle Morton, the famous free party just south of Liverpool, which was the one that led to the criminal justice bill. And so, but before that, they were doing free parties all over the country. So I was aware of that through him. And then I started going out in Leeds with my mates, and I got really quite sort of caught up in the rave thing and the house thing. And then I went to see Sasha play at Shelley's, which was a nightclub near Stoke, and that was a transformative evening. It was just like it's like etched on, seared on my brain, almost every moment of it. And that I just never kind of looked back from that. From that moment on, I was using my money I was getting from playing jazz gigs to buy myself a drum machine, a 4-track, a little DX7, and start trying to make electronic music. And then there was a lad at school whose dad had loads of cash because he owned a snooker club, and he built a studio in the bottom of the snooker club, but the lad couldn't play any instruments. So I had this deal with him where I would go and help him play a few chords on his tunes that he wanted to try and make, and I had the studio for the night. So I kind of worked out how that worked by doing that, and then pressed up a few white labels. I drove up and down the country swapping white labels for house tunes from other people, and so overnight I kind of had a record collection. So I started DJing, and then eventually ended up in London, having done a few years of house music DJing, living in a flat with some other lads. We had a band called Beat Foundation, and we were doing some live gigs, and we just actually signed a deal with Virgin when meanwhile I've been doing some tunes with Tom, who my then girlfriend, now wife, introduced me to, because he had loads of funk and disco records that he wanted to learn how to sample. And just as with my long-time mates on the Beat Foundation front, we got offered this Virgin deal. That was when Zoe Ball played At the River on Radio 1, and that was that. I had to have a slightly awkward conversation with my flatmates that I was going to have to go Groove Armada woods.
I mean, that record at the River is so good. It still sounds so fresh today, and yeah, I really love it. What was the kind of genesis of that in terms of, you know, the Patty Page sample is so great. Like, how did you guys discover that? It's Old Cape Cod, right? The song.
Yeah, Old Cape Cod. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I guess, like all music or of existence or anything, it's infinitely improbable, the whole thing. In that we were doing these parties in East London with this guy called Tim Lovely, who had a Tommy Touch label that we were releasing some tunes on, and this is when East London was derelict, and they were these brilliant warehouse parties, and he said, look, we've done a few EPs. I said, can you go off for a week and come back with an album, because it would be a great tool to promote these parties with. So we did, and for some reason, God knows why, we picked this cottage. I think, well, because it had no neighbours, but why this particular one, I don't know. But it was a cottage up in the Lake District somewhere. And we went up there with like basically nothing, like a sampler which had 9-second memory on it, one synth, and what was a very bulky and early Apple Mac. And that was it. And so, and we made some nice grooves and stuff, heavily sample based. Princess Diana died that week, and so we got this mad stuff off the radio with people talking about that, which you can still hear on tunes like Pillar 13. And then at the end of the week, we went to the local village shop to get the I think it was Boddingtons we were drinking back then, and on the counter was this 50p CD sale, and on the top of which was this CD called Sounds of the 50s. I just threw it in there with the beers, thinking there might be a sample on there somewhere. And it also happened that I had a jazz gig when we got back to London, because I was still making a few quid from doing those at the time. So I had my trombone with me, and I needed to practice. So I copied the chords off that song because they were lovely, playing all the old blues riffs that I used to play with my dad, and it sounded nice. So I thought, well, that sounds quite nice. I'll record it, but we had no microphone. But there happened to be a hi-fi in the cottage with those speakers where you can take the wires out of the stereo system. You've got these little plastic clips. And so I attached those bits of wire to a guitar cable and turned the speaker into a microphone. And that kind of gave it a bit of a Louis Armstrong sound, because it was a bit, it wasn't very well recorded. And then, and so on and so on. So you couldn't really make it up.
That is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I suppose, I should know that, but it's great to hear that for the first time. Yeah. And where did you develop this type, the type of expertise where you could do things like, turn a speaker into a microphone? Is that just kind of, are you quite inquisitive naturally about that type of thing, or did you learn it when you spent some time in studios before that, or?
Yeah, I think it comes from that. It comes from being up downstairs at the snooker club, and then when I moved to London, I mean, astonishingly, really, I went to see the bank manager, and Nat West, and they were doing some kind of youth initiative loans or something. And I was on the dole on housing benefit, and I managed to persuade him to lend me 1,500 quid to buy a second-hand mixing desk and a sampler, and he did, which was amazing. I owe him a debt of gratitude, and I can't even remember his name, which is Paul. But all the way down the line, I've never sort of like worked in someone else's studio. I've always just done it, and so little by little you work out how things work, because it's kind of, there's a danger, I think, that when a lot of people who I've met who've asked for like studio advice and stuff, they've been told that a certain button will do a certain thing, but they haven't got any idea why. And it's kind of the downside of doing it the way I did is that I learned some terrible lessons, like when I discovered compression for the first time and thought it sounded really exciting, because that's that radio sound is compression, and it does sound really exciting, except that when you put it on a tune that's going to be played in nightclubs, it just sounds like an absolute racket, unless you've got what I now realise you need very high quality compression that's quite subtle and all the rest of it. But on one occasion I just whacked it on because this is my brand new discovery. It sounded amazing. I spent all my money on pressing up these white labels. I gave it to the DJ in SW1 Club in London, and within like 4 seconds it was clear that it was just a disaster. So I had lots and lots of experiences like that, been quite painful. But the good side of working it all out is that I do understand what's around the back, and so you can use that to try some interesting stuff sometimes.
So did you learn these skills, yourself? Were you never kind of taught specifically by anyone? You didn't do any type of like strange course or anything like that. It was, you're kind of self-taught in your expertise.
Yeah, I just did it myself. I mean, the snooker club arrangement was one that I repeated several times actually over the next few years, where I would go and be the jobbing musician in the daytime, playing piano or bass or whatever was needed, and then I get locked in for the night. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily fancy that anymore, but yeah, just be there for 12 hours by myself, just doing stuff, and lots of frustration. You like be like 4 or 5 hours, you just can't fucking work out how to do something. And so it wasn't like it was all roses by any means, but it was a good education.
And so you met Tom, and you kind of had other stuff going on, and At the River became big, and you decided, okay, Groove Armada is what I want to pursue. What do you think you and Tom bring to Groove Armada that's different? In what ways do you differ, and in what ways are you kind of on the same page?
Well, I think that's changed and probably narrowed over time. At the beginning, Tom was like, he came from Cambridge, where there was a big funk disco scene. Like DJ Harvey was just a few years older than Tom, and he was the king of the castle in Cambridge. Tim Lovely, again, it was all about the funk and disco. And I was, by the time I got down south, I was very much on the house tip. So it was actually when we had to start DJing, the Groove Armada began as parties in 2 rooms, and I was playing house in one, he was playing funk and disco in another. It was actually when we had to go to a 1-room venue, having lost all our money to a con man who'd sold us a reservation on a boat for a boat party, but the boat didn't exist, and we'd had to go to a 1-room venue and work out a way of playing together that. Tom opened up to house and I opened up to what he was playing, and that was where, looking back on it, the kind of fusion of a whole host of stuff, which has been our signature. If we've got a trademark, it's being a bit all over the place, I suppose, musically, and that's probably where it began, in that little basement somewhere in the West End, which I can't remember the name of.
And so when you started gaining some traction as Groove Armada, your first record was Northern Star, but At the River came out again on the Vertigo album, and I remember that, like, I would have been about 9 or 10 when Vertigo came out. I remember having a copy of it and thinking it was like a really fantastic album. How come you decided to release At the River on both records? And was Vertigo kind of bigger than Northern Star?
No, Vertigo was the bigger one, because Northern Star was released on Tommy Touch, and so that was that was a tiny label, but that was the one that got it got on the cover of Music Magazine, which was the magazine at the time, and it was still, while it was on Tommy Touch, that because we put out a 7-inch, and that was what Zoe Ball was playing on her breakfast show. So that's what kind of got the ball rolling. But Vertigo was after, because of that bit, we signed to Jive. So we were on a, in quotes, proper label, a major label, and we signed to a guy called Scott McLaughlin, who was on fire at the time, just signing dance hit after dance hit. So he was golden boy. He had the ear of radio. Everything felt possible. And so Vertigo, was they put At the River on there because it was a big tune that had been kind of released already, but by the small guys. Now it's time for the big guys to show how to do it properly, kind of thing. So it was a pure commercial decision.
Yeah, that's kind of what the impression that I got. But like the first time that I listened to your music was Vertigo, so I just kind of was interested in that. And so, I mean, there have been many highlights from your career, and obviously I want to ask a bit later about deep cuts and lesser known tracks, but I'm also very interested to sort of hear the stories behind some of your bigger songs, which I'm sure my listeners will be too. So I See You Baby, how did that come about?
I See You Baby was the I was going to say brainchild, but I don't know. I think that's overstating. I think it was the product of an amazing week in Ibiza. Ibiza's been a real kind of like route and sort of main vein of Groove Armada, and I've been going there until this year. I've been there every year since 1988, so it's been a real kind of source of inspiration. But this particular year was right up there because we went to play at Manumission, and it was when Manumission were absolutely having it. You know, it was outrageous, and it was everything that people kind of imagine when they think about Ibiza. But it was done with a lot of fun and humour and sort of irony as well, you know. But and it was based around just a quite just an unashamed love of a great party and all the elements of that, including the sexual elements of that. And, you know, they were just having it. It was just and at the heart of it all was the Manumission Motel, which is this former brothel that they'd taken over, and where everyone involved in the thing stayed. So there were the strippers, the promoters, the DJs, everyone was in this place, and in the bottom of it was this 24/7 club, and various people would sort of wander off the street into it, and it was just a free-for-all, and an amazing cast of characters. I mean, it does seem like just a sort of kind of diversity and lawlessness, but also richness of humanity in there, which in the era of like champagne and lots of red rope and VIP access has gone from a lot of dance music experiences, I think, unfortunately. But it was amazing, and amongst all this chaos, there was this woman called Grandma Funk, who was the hostess with the mostess, obviously that's her phrase, and she was there in her nightie just sort of shouting stuff out and being a great hostess, and she really had a vibe. So when we delivered the album to Scott at Jive, he was like, "That's cool, lads, but we need some hits," and so we got Grandma over to Tottenham and tried to recreate this Manumission Motel in an industrial estate in Tottenham by giving her a few red stripes and just letting her go for it. And she just sort of ranted on about nothing in particular, but at one stage she said, "I see you," and then another point she said, "baby," and then about an hour later said, "shaking that out." So when we put all three of them together, it was a wrap.
That's so brilliant. There's one more kind of song focus that I wanted to ask you about, which was Superstyling, which is such a banger, really. How did that get produced?
That was a really long process, actually. In that it started when Fabric opened, 1999, I think. We had a residency in room 3 upstairs, which was brilliant at the time because the booth was kind of bigger than the dance floor, and so the booth was just packed with our mates, and the room was just one of those kind of sweat off the walls kind of rooms. Great atmosphere, great fun, and we often had Mike MAD, our MC friend, would come and join the kind of chaos and shout things now and again, and we were playing this deep house groove, dead simple, just bass line, kick drums thing. And he said something, Superstyling. And even amongst all the chaos that was going on at the time, we were like, "Mike, you've got to remember that until after the weekend, because that's a really good word." And so the following week or so, he came and riffed around that for a bit, from which we kind of put the verses together and got the sound of the Groove Armada Superstyling bit, which is over this deep groove, which we kind of nicked off this record that we were playing. And it was nice, but it wasn't anything more than nice. And it stayed like that for quite a long time. And then meanwhile, we'd gone off, God knows why, but we went off very ill-advised into the countryside to record the Goodbye Country Hell, a Nightclub album. And we were just in this, it was mental where we ended up. And we ended up with, there was a mixing desk delivered in 1,000 pieces because the person who could transport it was the person who we'd beaten in the auction to buy it. So it was the Cocteau Twins' old mixer that was delivered in 1,000 pieces just before it was about to rain all over the lawn. It took us about 4 months just to get that bloody thing working. And then it was just a very surreal. There's people coming from London and just going mad and chasing geese around the garden. And it was a chaotic session. And in the middle of all that, we kept coming back to this Superstyling tune. By now, the bass line had become the bass line that's on the tune. And we'd added a few horns on there. But still, it was just a groover. And actually, it was just right at the end of the process, which is probably 8 or 9 months since Fabric Evening, where we moved the bass line back so it came in halfway through the vocal, and that just changed everything. That just became this moment. It's like, well, if we just build to that, that's killer. And so when we did that maneuver, 2 days later we were going to be playing at Norman Cook's Big Beach boutique thing in Brighton, the first one that went crazy, where there was 500,000 people. I don't know how many people there were, but it seemed like everyone in the UK was on Brighton Beach. And so it was a bit of a rush to get that sorted. So and that's where we tried it for the first time. And it has been the best get out of jail card anyone could have ever wished for 20 years since then.
And so how from that early stage, you guys had you know, a few years where you were really unstoppable, but you've kind of continued, and one thing that I love about your music is that you make proper albums, and probably, well, one of my favorites, it might be my favorite, is the Black Light album that came out, I think it was in 2011. Why did you decide to do White Light, where you rearranged those songs and did different versions of them?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad you said that, because Black Light is also I think our favourite album. We're deeply proud of that record, and it's kind of unfortunate that when it came out, we were between lots of stools in terms of labels and this and that and the other. So it was kind of the world's best kept secret. Although actually, despite having no hype or no radio play or no press or anything, Paper Romance became one of Radio 6's most played tunes of the decade in the end. So I suppose it gives you hope that good music gets out in the end, you know. But yeah, that was a one where it was, we really wanted to encapsulate that kind of blend of guitars and electronics that would become our signature live sound. And so we thought we'd done that as best as we could. And then we took those versions and we decided to do a tour in 2010, which was the last tour before we stopped. It's sort of just a bit worn out by EDM's ascendancy, really. And on that tour, we decided to, apart from Superstyling and I think At the River, only play tunes from Black Light. We went quite ballsy on it. And so as we arranged the tunes for live, as we always do, we kind of, you know, we've got that DJ sensibility of what makes a big moment and how to synchronize the things and the lights and the lasers, and make sure that by getting those moments big, it allows you to play what is often quite deep or quite weird music, because you created that moment of togetherness which was required. And as we did that, the songs, or some of them, we were like, Jesus, that's how it should have been on the album, you know. So just for our own sake, really, by that point, because you know, no one was paying much attention to Black Light. We just thought these versions are good, but let's while everyone's still kicking around, let's record them. So that was the story there. But then just after we'd done that, out of the blue completely, because we felt like we were just operating in a void at the time, came the fact that it had been nominated for a Grammy. So how that worked, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, that must have been some vindication if you were finding it, you know, difficult with the kind of radio play side of things initially, although, you know, that's great about Paper Romance being one of the most played tunes. And how did the collaboration with Bryan Ferry come about? Because, I mean, it sounded like that type of thing, you know, Roxy Music and Eno was a fair influence on the project in general. So
No, it was absolutely that, and of course, and David Bowie, the person who he always wanted to book for Lovebox but never could. But yeah, he was a total hero and a big influence on a lot of those tunes as well. And he's also a big influence on Nick Littlemore, who summoned a few of those tunes. But the Bryan Ferry one. Yeah, I mean, I didn't realise going into this whole courtship, because it was quite a long courtship, that he'd never collaborated with anyone ever. And had we realised that, we probably wouldn't have even tried. But the key to it was this fantastic guy who's his studio engineer stroke court jester stroke all round lovely bloke called Johnson, and it was evenings and dinners and stuff with us and Bryan, and finally gets to the point where Bryan said that he was up for trying something, and I didn't realise at the time that he'd never collaborated with anyone else ever, and had we realised that, we probably wouldn't have even bothered trying. But he said he was up for something, and then there's sort of part two of like on the hotline to Johnson in the studio, and Johnson saying, he just can't quite find the words, and he can't quite find the melody, and on it went the saga until eventually Bryan had his inspiration. And we got this vocal, and the vocal was great, but the groove that we'd sent for him to do the vocal on wasn't doing it justice. And so with some musician friends over here in France, we took Bryan's vocal and just had an all-night jam, basically. Kind of sent it back to him for approval when there was about half an hour to go before everything got mastered. So that was the kind of heart in the mouth thing, from a process that had been so slow and careful, to kind of rip everything up and throw everything back in the mix again with sort of half an hour to go. Seemed a bit crazy, but we got the call from Johnson saying that Bryan loved it, and that was a very, very satisfying moment to have really done his vocal justice and been the first and maybe the last people with whom he collaborated.
Yeah, what an amazing thing to have done. Such an iconic artist. And so you guys have just released Edge of the Horizon, which is your first. Is it your first album in about 10 years?
It is. Yeah, we've released quite a lot of house tunes in the meantime, but it's the first album for 10 years. Yeah.
And how come you left it so long before making a full LP?
We weren't going to make another album after Black Light because it had been a fairly torturous recording process, to be honest, which took its toll on us sort of individually and collectively. And having gone through that and kind of come out with something which we were deeply proud of, and then released it kind of into a void, plus the fact that live wasn't easy because of the rise of EDM, and so we found ourselves, sandwiched between laid back Luke and David Guetta trying to play songs like Cards to Your Heart. It wasn't simple. So gigs had always been amazing, and they were becoming not amazing, and we just thought, well, let's just stop, and just we've done what we need to do now. We'll just go back underground. We'll make house music, and just DJ, and just go back to having a nice time, and just get off the main stages and stop chasing after radio plays and stop all that stuff. And that's what we did, and it was actually really nice. And we released lots of tunes actually on very small labels. Took a big sort of pay cut, and just to make sure that we were in the nightclubs where you can play the kind of house music that we love, and we were having a nice time. And it was only because we decided that before we just stopped definitively, that we wanted to get the live squad back together, just because they're such a nice group of people with whom we had such an amazing set of experiences. And so we decided, just for the fun of it, to do a few long weekends of live gigs. And they were just electric. We were standing on stage at the Warehouse Project in Manchester. And we were like, hang on, this feels really good, and that sort of got us thinking and talking. And there was so much on the cutting room floor from Black Light when we kind of lost it a bit, and kind of lost the ability to know what was good and not good and everything else, that even just going through that, we ended up with about 12 or 15 ideas for new tunes. And so slowly we got into gear, you know, and then we had the first of what we ended up doing the album in a series of like really intense long weekends of sort of 72-hour sessions in Tom's basement with a fridge full of beers and the phone off, like back to the old days. And after the first one of those weekends, it was just really fun. You know, it was just the simple joy of just being uniquely focused on making tunes that you really like. And so from that moment on, it was no great hardship really to see it through.
That's really nice to hear that you kind of made it because you had rediscovered that joy of making music. And you know, one of the most kind of anthemic tunes on the album is "Get Out on the Dance Floor," and you know, that's another collaboration with Nick Littlemore. When did you guys first start, you know, occasionally working and collaborating with him?
That was all the collaborations with him actually were on that. Well, Face to Face were for the Black Light album. There was that. God, I can't remember the name of it now. It's one of my favourite tunes on the record as well. Fall Silent on Black Light. And of course, Cards to Your Heart, which has become a sort of quiet classic of the live set. And so, yeah, we only actually had one studio session with him for a day in London for the Black Light thing. Basically what happens when you work with Nick is that he goes into the booth surrounded by bits of paper and just goes off on one and sometimes sings or screams or shouts, and it's just a stream of consciousness stuff. And then we work quite well together because although I say to myself, I'm pretty good with the scissors and turning chaos into order from those kind of performances, and I think he quite enjoyed that. And so yeah, so those songs for Black Light were sort of slowly built from these various different things that he said, often like sometimes hours apart. But there was a lot left behind. And one of the first things that I opened up just out of curiosity, because it had his name in the title, when we started doing the new record, was a screen full of outtakes. And just these little phrases that I couldn't use, but I thought sounded cool. And they're all unconnected. And it was a bit intimidating. It was like quite a big screen of lots of small bits. But little by little, it kind of fused itself together into this quite talking headsy David Byrne vocal. And that was really quite fun after that, because it was unusual. Normally it's music first, vocal second, but there we had a fully formed vocal that you could do anything you want underneath. And so once again, I went to my local musicians mates, the drummers' garage, semi-soundproof garage, and we just jammed it out, you know, sort of talking head style, and then bumped it up with some synths at Tom's place a couple of weeks later.
Oh, and you know, on Edge of the Horizon, you know, I noticed that you guys, you know, you've been getting some great reviews for the album, which must be, you know, pretty uplifting given the fact it's been a while since you made a full album. But I noticed that perennially people seem to be talking about how you guys have saved clubbing and stuff, just as all the nightclubs are shutting down. For somebody who has, you know, a deep connection to house music and electronic music and to playing in nightclubs, and you know, you're describing your years in the 90s of DJing before Group Armada. Does it make you sad to see all the nightclubs kind of shuttered? And are you optimistic for a return at any stage?
Well, obviously it makes me desperately sad, because when I think of, you know, I'm incredibly lucky in that I've had 25 years of that, you know, and so if it never happens again, it's much less dramatic for me than for someone who's 17, you know.
Yeah.
But and I think it's those moments of shared humanity that you get in places like that, which perhaps isn't understood by a lot of the people who make decisions. But there's a combination of house music and people in a small dark room, or even a big dark room, which creates a moment of togetherness, which is really profound, you know. And and desperately needed. And when you strip all that heart out of society, I think you have to sort of ask yourself at what point what's left, and what you're sacrificing, and what your priorities are. And you know, I think that when you've stood in the crowd or from the DJ booth for hundreds and thousands of times and felt that visceral coming together of people, we can't let that slip away. And obviously this doesn't just apply to nightclubs, it applies to all kind of other cultural stuff and sporting stuff for that matter. But you know, this is the glue, this is what makes us human. And we've got to fight to get that back, because otherwise I think the collateral damage may well be greater than the immediate damage.